So they lock in their goals every 5 weeks, and then they're accountable for those goals to their classmates and to their teachers. And if you walk into a primary micro school, kids could be playing soccer outside, and you can walk up to a kid and say like, hey, Jeremiah, like, where are you at on your math goal? Like, he will know like exactly where he's at, ahead, behind, without ever looking at his dashboard. Like, they've totally internalized this. And this is like a third grader. Like, these are not eighth graders. And so kids have total agency over the academic process. So we're non-negotiable about, hey, like, we're not going to apologize that we believe math and reading are important and you're going to work super hard at this and we're going to have really rigorous academics. But we say like, you're going to set these goals and then you're accountable to them. And you got to get in front of the class 5 weeks from now and say whether or not you hit them or not, just like real life. And it turns out that when you do that, kids get really motivated.
Ryan, thanks for joining me today.
Happy to be here.
I thought a fun place to start would be a letter that your mom wrote a paper actually on why homeschooling was a really bad idea.
Yeah.
And then you were homeschooled for many years of your childhood.
Yep.
Can we start there?
Yeah. So she'll probably kill me for telling this story, but so my mom was a public school teacher and public school teacher for many years before I was born. And then when I was young, and we moved from Atlanta to Florida. And when she was in college getting her teaching degree, she wrote a paper. I remember reading it or her telling me about it, but it's some version of like all like alternative education should be illegal. Like you should not be able to have kids be homeschooled, private school, charter school. Like it should just be public school. And that was kind of like her, that was where she was at. And then we moved to Florida and she took me to kindergarten orientation at the public school that we were zoned for. And we had no money. So it wasn't an option to like go to private school, or there wasn't really any charter schools then. And she freaked out and she's like, I can't leave you here. And this was early 90s in Florida. So I don't know exactly where they ranked, but I think last time I checked, it was like Florida was like 46th in the nation in terms of school quality. So this is like a bad school in a bad state for public schools. And she freaks out and she's like, I can't leave you here. And so I think in that moment, the way she told me is like that moment basically was like her whole worldview like switched.
Yep.
And I assume where you're going with this is she ended up starting a Microschool co-op for us and homeschooling us. She thought she'd do it for a year and she ended up doing it for much longer. But everything kind of like 180'd for her right then.
Well, the apple doesn't fall far from the tree. So we'll get to what you're doing today. But I think to set the stage of what you're doing today, as you see it, what's wrong with education in America today, especially for kids?
We could talk a long time about this. So there's the structural problems, there's incentive problems, and then there's like personal, day-to-day problems for kids. So the structural problems, my contrarian take, which a lot of people in alternative education probably wouldn't say this, is if you told me that I had to design an education system for 70 million kids and it had to be basically the exact same real estate profile, exact same staffing model, exact same curriculum, exact same everything, so a totally homogeneous system and work in every state, I don't know that I could do better than what currently exists. And so what I reject is just the idea that you should have this homogeneous system where every public school is almost the exact same structure, exact same setup. And so that's the first piece of it. And then you have an incentive problem, which is at the staffing level with teachers. Teachers are incentivized. Basically, the entire incentive model, compensation incentive model for teachers is downside minimization. So there's no, like if you're a top performing teacher in a district, you might get like a plaque and like maybe like a $500 bonus, so you get to go to like a conference or something. But we basically rely on the fact that teachers happen to be like super altruistically motivated for them to go above and beyond to help kids succeed and get ahead. And so you have this incentive problem where teachers are not, in my opinion, they're not properly incentivized to help kids get ahead and go beyond. They're basically just incentivized to make sure that some percentage of their class is not failing the state tests. And then you have the day-to-day personal experience of kids where what parents want and what students want is not going to be met by this giant homogeneous industrialized system. And so you have students that need smaller class sizes or bigger class sizes, more time on, ELA, less time on math, more time on math, less time on ELA. And there's just no ability to personalize that when you have kids going through effectively an assembly line from 8 to 3 every day.
How long has the current system been in place? Isn't this from like the early 1900s or even predating that?
Yeah, we could go back to like horseman, all sorts of, you can go way back in history, but yeah, there's been different versions of it, but it's like the sort of early 20th century is when you started to see the current, which also like coincides with a lot of the way that people's professional lives in America changed in terms of how they were working jobs in the US, shifted. And the kind of like dirty secret of education is that childcare is a huge component of it. You need a place, if you're working a job, you need a place for your kid to go from 8 to 3 every day.
Yeah.
And so that was originally a huge component of it. And it's now this thing that like no one really talks about, but is a huge piece of the value of education for families.
And I think we figured that out in COVID when people were having to work and keep their kid at home and keep them in school.
Exactly.
It didn't really work.
Exactly.
What do you think about incentivizing teachers? Like, what would be a good way to incentivize them? How would they be incentivized to make sure their students are succeeding and doing really well? Is it purely financial?
So I don't know the counterfactual, so it's hard to say definitively, but I would love to run an experiment in a district where you basically say, hey, we have private funding that's gonna layer on this compensation plan on top of your existing. So whatever the unions negotiated, like that can stay, but we're going to do this additional compensation plan on top of that. And we're going to set up a series of incentive-based, basically milestones that teachers can hit. The challenge with this is that you get into, situations where whatever you just decide to quantify to tie to those incentives, teachers are going to be, you end up in a situation where they teach to the test or whatever. So you have to be really thoughtful about it. But I'm pretty convinced that if you had the right incentive structure in place, and in most districts, you could just reallocate budget from the administrative sort of bureaucratic budget and shift that over to teachers, you could drive much better student outcomes, and you could incentivize teachers to go above and beyond much more often for kids. And then all of a sudden, if you have a kid that you can get, a year ahead or two grades ahead in math, like that becomes a really big deal. And you're incentivized to focus on that and make it happen, instead of just, okay, I need to make sure 60% of my kids, are going to pass the state test in April when we take it.
Okay. You told me about one incentive structure that you think's messed up. I'm going to read it to you.
Okay.
The incentive structures, both social and economics, for teachers in the traditional education world are completely broken. The incentives are all oriented around avoiding downside, kids failing, and place zero emphasis on the upside, kids excelling. Almost no one talks about this, but it's at the root of many of the problems in the education system. Is that exactly what we were just talking about?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Okay. The second one then is the idea that where all the money's going.
Yeah.
Talk about that.
So there's been, so per pupil, everyone talks about per pupil spending in the US. And so if you look at, let's back up. So the way that education is funded in the US is a combination of local, state, and federal dollars, depending on the type of school. So it could be a public school, charter school, magnet school. And what most people think is that it's basically property tax dollars goes to fund schools, which is directionally correct, but there's other money that gets pulled in. And so a charter school might have state funding they pull in, sometimes federal money, et cetera. But depending on the district, schools are spending anywhere between $12,000 to $13,000 to like $30,000 a kid in the public school system. And there's all this data out there about per pupil spending, and people talk about it and say that it's, not high enough or it's too high or whatever. But what's more interesting to me is to look at where the split of the spending is going. And so if you talk to someone who's a teacher in the 1980s, they would tell you like, oh, I've taught at this middle school and I had a principal, and maybe there was like an assistant principal, and then there was like some janitors and some ops people or whatever. But it was like basically a bunch of teachers and a principal. That was like the structure of a school. Now you have this entire class of consultants, administrators. It's the same thing that's happened in almost every industry in the US, where you have this sort of bureaucratic layer that's been layered on top. And so when you look at the percentage of so per pupil spending goes up, but the amount that teachers are actually making is not going up at the same rate. And so most of that spending is actually going to this new class of professional services, consultants, et cetera, on top of the school layer. And I don't think it's probably an oversimplification to say like you should just give all the money to the teachers, but that's kind of what we do at Primer. And I think that is to a first approximation, that is a much better way to deliver better student outcomes, is to say, hey, we're going to give as much money as possible is going to go into the classroom with the student, in the direction of teacher compensation, classroom supplies, et cetera. And I think for most schools, you could cut a ton of this bureaucracy at the top and be almost like every industry in the US and be totally fine. But that's where all the politics and everything happens. So those continue to get funded.
So when you say all that, one thing I think about is what's going on at the Ivy League universities right now, where the main issues have nothing to do anymore with educating kids. It has to do with this huge bureaucratic layer that's now just forcing different agendas and ideologies on people. How do you have an opinion on like how that actually works its way out? Is it going to become a supply demand thing where just nobody demands going to those type of places anymore and they wash themselves out? Or is there a better way to fix it?
I'm not an expert on, so the higher ed stuff I'm not an expert on. My sort of armchair quarterback opinion would be, I think it's very likely that if you rank the top 20 schools that kids, that 16-year-olds, ambitious 16-year-olds want to go to today, I think it's very likely that the next 10 years have the highest reshuffling of the last 50 in what those schools are.
Yeah.
And so I think it's very likely that you have some public schools that become very aspirational for ambitious kids. I think it's very likely that you have a few of the historically, top schools are no longer attractive to really ambitious kids. And I think probably most of that would be reshuffling of existing schools, but there's also efforts like University of Austin that Joe Lonsdale, Barry Weiss, and those folks are working on that I think have they're talk about product market fit. Like they're like the perfect time. And obviously that's part of the impetus for starting was all this stuff going on. And so I think you will probably see some new players arise, but I also think you will see, and this kind of happened at MIT and to some extent Stanford, some of these schools that are the like legacy places that everyone wants to go to are saying, hey, we're going to cut out all this crap and we're going to get back to basics. And they will probably be rewarded for that is my guess.
Okay. Going back to more developing education kids, do you have an opinion on the actual curriculum that's being taught in, call it private, public, or the standardized? Like, is it actually a reflection of what kids need to know today? Or are these just filler courses that because we've always taught them, we're kind of teaching them now?
I think it's it depends on the subject. So certainly, at primer, we are very heavily emphasize math and reading. And so we kids spend 100 minutes a day on math and 100 minutes a day on ELA, which could be reading, writing, different things. And we're very non-apologetic about that. So we believe math, the promises that we make to families is that one of them is math and reading are the foundations of learning. And so, we spend way more time on that than almost any other school in the US. And then we believe that things like science and social studies and these things that are traditional like classes at public and private schools should actually be 100% experiential. So kids should be, writing letters to their, representatives about things they're excited about. They should be starting companies, launching podcasts, writing books, working on science projects. You shouldn't learn science from a textbook. You should learn it by working on projects. And so, we sort of divide it into those two categories, and that's our sort of pedagogy on it. I think my opinion on the state standards is that they're mostly fine. Like I don't think that there's different things that we tweak, but there is some value in the fact that there's fungibility between schools. And so the counterfactual, if you were to just remove state standards, is that a kid moves from this district to this district, like all of a sudden they're on two totally different systems. And so like abolishing state standards is very popular. But practically, especially with how much people move now, it's a little bit, people don't really think about the fact that the fungibility is like a very important feature of the school system.
What are state standards?
So their individual states have, this basically you can think of it like a list of all the different atomic units of a given subject that people need to learn in a given grade. And so it might be like 3-digit addition, 3-digit subtraction, things like that. And then there's milestones that kids are supposed to hit based on their progression through those grades. And then any curriculum is supposed to, if it's used in a state, is supposed to take them through those milestones in the same way over roughly the same, structure.
Are we getting smarter as a society?
How do you define smarter?
I don't know. You have attacked this problem. I guess one way to do it would just be like test scores, but that's probably not the right answer.
Yeah.
like, I don't know, how do you look at it? Well, maybe let me rephrase the question. Is the current education system benefiting our kids more today than it did, say, 30 years ago? Or is it still like a flat line?
It's very hard to quantify.
Okay.
So there's these famous things where people will say, okay, like here's the, Harvard entrance exam from 19 whatever 30 versus like the one to, the equivalent today. And here's, how much harder it was back then. And so there's a lot of research that the overall rigor around tests and different milestones that people compare is not as strong today as it was previously. And so you can say that test scores are going up or they're flat or whatever, but there's accommodations being made to maintain that. My view is that what's missing is so maybe zooming out, my view is that the industrialization of education is the experiment. For all of human history, it's been effectively microschools. It's been a small group of kids with a great teacher who is motivated and excited about teaching those kids. And that's how every human has learned forever. And then we had this industrialization of education that's happened over the last 80 years. And everyone acts like microschools and homeschooling and these alternative educations is the experiment. But that's actually the thing that has always been the way we've done it. This industrialization thing is the big experiment. And so are we getting smarter? It's very hard to quantify that. So I don't think I have like a clear answer on it, but I do feel very strongly that even outside of academics, if you think about the formation of humans and what the goal of education, which I believe is helping every kid reach their potential, I do not believe the current education system is delivering what it should, especially relative to how much we spend on it for kids.
All right. Well, then let's talk about the idea of what you're doing today. So you started a company called Primer. So clearly something was tapping on your heart that there's a better way to do this.
Yep.
And one thing you actually said was, and I think this is the mission of the company, I could be wrong, but you're there to take kids seriously. So I guess the first question is, are we not taking kids seriously right now?
We have this, in our office, we have this neon sign that just takes kids seriously. So it's the first thing you see when I walk in every morning. Awesome. And it became kind of like this, I don't know, rallying cry phrase, whatever, internally for us. And I think why we all gravitated towards it, it's really like student agency is the less like, marketing-y way to talk about it. And so we try to inject student agency into every part of the process that we can for the student experience. And I think if you tried to distill down what works about homeschooling, I think a huge part of that is just agency. Kids are able to move at their own pace. When they master something, they move on. If they haven't mastered it, they don't move on. They have learned skills of time allocation. So how am I going to spend the next hour, 2 hours? It's not determined for them. They have to learn that. They often have optionality of how they spend the time in the afternoons or different, passion projects. And so we try to inject agency at every turn. And so that translates to Primer in the two main ways. On core academics, kids set their goals and they're accountable to those goals. So every 5 weeks, they log into their Primer dashboard. They see exactly where they're at on every single subject. They see where they would be if they worked, we call it like, I think it's like standard, fast and then lightning. And they can basically like pick how fast they want to go and how much really just like how hard they want to work every day. And then based on that, we show them a projection of where they would be at the end of those 5 weeks and then at the end of the year. And so we show them like, hey, if you were willing to work, extra time every afternoon, you would be finished with like, you're a third grader, you'd be finished with 4th grade or 5th grade math by the end of the year. And they can decide if they want to do that. So they lock in their goals every 5 weeks and then they're accountable for those goals to their classmates and to their teachers. And if you walk into a Primer Microschool, kids could be playing soccer outside and you can walk up to a kid and say like, hey, Jeremiah, like, where are you at on your math goal? Like he will know like exactly where he's at, ahead, behind, without ever looking at his dashboard. Like they've totally internalized this. And this is like a 3rd grader. Like these are not 8th graders. And so kids have total agency over the academic process. So we're non-negotiable about, hey, like, we're not going to apologize that we believe math and reading are important and you're going to work super hard at this and we're going to have really rigorous academics. But we say like, you're going to set these goals and then you're accountable to them. And you got to get in front of the class 5 weeks from now and say whether or not you hit them or not, just like real life. And it turns out that when you do that, kids get really motivated. And so we have kids that come to Primer. We had a kid, a 3rd grader came to Primer, couldn't read. We were talking through the goals with him and he said, hey, I'm sick of getting made fun of that I can't read, because he got made fun of at his old school. And the teacher said, well, you're not going to get made fun of at Primer, but if you want to learn to read, like you can click that lightning button and I will give you everything you need if you're willing to work really, really hard. And he was in the first percentile in reading on his MAP score, which means he was behind 99% of kids in the US. And he went from the first percentile to the 30th percentile 12 weeks later. And he grew faster than 99% of kids in the US over those weeks. And so the student agent thing works. Like, I'm very, very high conviction on that. The second thing we do is then in the afternoons, kids get to determine how they want to spend their afternoon time. So we call them primer pursuits. And so kids can do projects with other kids. So they could say like, hey, we want to work on this project together as a group. They can get a budget for it. They can organize it. Or they can go do, it's almost like independent study. So if they want to write a book or launch a podcast or start a company or whatever, they can go do that. And so we've had kids that have done, analysis for NFL draft, picks, like running like a data model to figure out like who the Miami Dolphins should draft in the NFL draft based on their current, roster and who's available. We've had kids work on like very in-depth science projects. We had a kid that was sick of like having to turn his lamp on at night. And so he built like LED reading glasses from scratch. And so it's just like, and these kids just invent these projects and they just go for it. And so in both of those cases, like the kids, there's guardrails for it and it has to be, they have to work hard. We have a culture of this, like we call it earnest work, but they have agency and they feel like they're in the driver's seat. And so that's what taking kids seriously means for us. And I think that's, if you talk to most parents that send their kids to primer, like that's what they would say is the defining feature.
So take that third grade example of reading, just how it works. Do you guys give like a list of potential goals and they pick which one, or they literally tell me how he would have picked a goal? Like, what's the process a third grader goes through to pick a badass reading goal?
So in reading, it's a little bit more binary. It's like, are you on grade level or not? And like, can you read or not?
Yeah.
And then once you can read, so once you understand phonics and you can actually, read a book and understand it, then it's like reading comprehension, it's writing, it's these other ELA components. Math is a much more like granular example. So with math, they'll see a dashboard and it'll literally be like 3-digit subtraction, 3-digit addition. It'll either be like checked off because like they've mastered it, or it won't be. And when they master it, they'll see it. Their parents will see it. Everyone has like total transparency into it. So you're not waiting like 6 weeks for a report card. It's like, right away if they mastered it. And so the feedback loop for kids is like very rewarding because they're seeing, like they understand the concept of like, hey, I didn't know this thing. And then I like go work hard. And then now I know this thing. And it's not like a month-long process. It's like, oh, in a week or in 3 days, I've mastered this new thing and I can see the progress that I'm making towards 4th grade or 5th grade or whatever math. And so it's very rewarding for them because it's like this very tight feedback loop. And then that becomes the high status thing. Like every school has like a culture where there's like high status and low status people and high status and low status behavior. That's like the high status behavior at primer is like working really hard and then being ahead on core academics or working on these really cool passion projects. And that's what we try to like instill in every kid.
Assuming that these kids are accelerating at the rate they're accelerating, like what's also interesting, you take it back to age. Like I met a guy the other day that graduated high school and when he was like 14 and started medical school and he was like 15.
Yeah.
And the first thing I thought is like, society's not really built for 15-year-olds to start medical school.
Yeah.
But if you're successful, you're going to be like launching these kids out into the world that are way ahead of their years. Have you thought at all about that? Like a world where what would be a typical senior is now like 12 or 13 years old.
So we don't do high school yet, but I tell the team and myself that like we have to earn the right to do high school because high school is where it gets really fun.
Yeah.
Like that's what I'm so excited about. Cause like when I was in high school, I remember like my dad, he emailed like all these business owners across where we lived in Orlando. And he just said, hey, my son's like interested in entrepreneurship. He's interested in starting companies. Would you just like get coffee with him? Could he come shadow you at your job? Like just talk to you. And so I met with someone running a coastal reconstruction company, insurance, auto dealerships, car body shops, like all these different jobs. And I was in 9th grade. And that was like such a formative experience for me getting exposure to that. And so that's like the dream for primers, that could you start to give kids real world experience, whether it's internships, apprenticeships, whatever it might be, very, very early on in their high school career. So that by the time they get into 11th, 12th grade, like they actually have a really good idea of what they want to do with their life. And for some kids that might be go to Harvard or Stanford and, go do amazing, biology research or whatever. For other kids, that might be like, hey, I want to start an HVAC company in my, small town. And we want primer to be like the best launching pad for them to go do that. So we want it to be like whatever, this is where it comes down to like, you want to maximize the probability that every kid can reach their potential. Like not every kid should go to Harvard. Not every kid should launch an HVAC company, but we want primer to be the best place for those kids, regardless of where they're headed.
All right. Well, let's take a step back real quick. You've mentioned Microschool. You've mentioned these kids getting on these dashboards. The Microschool actually has to be created.
Yeah.
So how does that even start?
So, this is what we spend all of our time on, basically. So
I figured you'd have a good answer for it.
Primer's goal is to help top 1% teachers launch microschools in their communities. That's it. Very simple. Very hard, but very simple. And so if you're an amazing teacher that loves your community and wants to start a school, we want to make that as simple as possible for you. And so I'm obsessed with the problem of how do you reduce the friction for each marginal new student seat that's available at Primer, because that's the simplest way to distill all this into one equation. And so that means helping the microschool leaders secure real estate. That means the state level approvals, the Department of Education, local fire, health, land use, zoning, all that stuff. And then it also means the student recruitment and the student experience. And so we have the Primer OS, the Primer operating system, which handles a lot of this now. And one way to think about it is that we're replacing like school bureaucrats with code.
Yep.
And so we're taking everything that would have a bunch of like paper pushing humans behind it, and we're just either automating it or we're building product that takes care of that for the teachers. And so the microschool leaders, they literally sign like one document at the beginning of the year, and then we handle everything for them. And they like can't believe it. They're like, I used to spend, one microschool leader told me she spent 4 hours every Saturday doing paperwork for her class. And she wasn't getting paid for this. Like she was probably making like 50 grand a year, and she's spending 4 hours of her Saturday doing paperwork. And so we automate all that. And so the hardest part right now is last year we had 1,800 microschool leaders apply to launch schools with Primer. We launched 18. But it's matching up the microschool leaders and the real estate and the families and connecting those three pieces. And so what we're obsessed with is how do you make it really easy for a microschool leader to go from like, hey, I'm an amazing teacher, I've proven that to Primer, I've gotten the opportunity to launch a microschool, to I'm live. And so we have a real estate model where microschool leaders partner with, and we help them partner with existing facilities that are like ready to go for a microschool. So you can think about like churches, community centers, libraries, performing arts centers, and they already have space that's available from 8 to 3 every day. It's usually nice, it's built out, it's safe, it already works for kids, and it's not in use. And so we're able to secure that space very cheaply for the microschool leader, which reduces their OpEx, and there's very little CapEx because it's usually ready to go. And then we help them go from that position where they've secured a location and they're ready to go to recruiting all their students and actually being live. And that's what the whole team basically works on all day, every day. And then once they're live, the microschool leader is like the superstar. Like they're the entrepreneur that's launching this, and they use our software, but like they're off to the races, and we sort of just stand in the background. So like parents know that it's a Primer school, and we want them to, obviously they have a positive association with us and the brand and the product, and they like the dashboards and all that. But we want them to like think of like, oh, Miss April is like amazing. Like she's like the teacher that changed my kid's life. Like that's what we want people to think about as Primer, is like the actual microschool leaders, not us. And so that's what we spend all of our time basically on, that formula.
And would a microschool leader hire other people underneath them? Is there usually a one-person job?
So it's usually one person with a studio guide.
Okay. And they're teaching all grades?
They teach up to 3 grades. So there's a lot of research that mixed age classrooms are really good for kids. So we do up to, so it could be like K through 2, 3 through 5, and 6 through 8. And they can pick which one they want to teach. They can also drill down lower if they have enough kids. And then they have a studio guide that helps them. And then, we have several microschool leaders who have recruited a lot of kids, and then they want to start like, a larger school. And so we'll help them do that and have multiple micro schools like under their school.
So is it fair to say that one of the biggest blockers for this is actually securing the real estate?
It has been. The new model, the new asset light model is working really well.
Okay.
But the real estate was the hardest. Figuring out how to crack real estate was the hardest part.
And the reason why the asset light is because your team just said, look, we'll go find the sites in your area that would work. So you don't even have to think about that. And as soon as you're ready to go, we'll give you a menu of 5 sites. You just pick which one you want to open in.
Or even better, our team doesn't have to do that. And we tell the microschool leader, hey, here's a church, a community center, a synagogue, a library in your area that we know will work. And the zoning works, the build out is good, like it's really high quality space, good visibility, all that. And you can go talk to them, and the hit rate on a teacher approaching a community center saying like, hey, I'm a local teacher, like I want to launch my micro school, is very, very high compared to like some company emailing them saying, hey, can we sublease the classroom? And so we empower them to go talk to those people, and then we take the risk on the lease and all that, but these leases are very inexpensive. And so we're not ever asking them to, legally get involved, but they help with sourcing and securing. And then we handle basically the step from there to, okay, you're approved zoning wise with the state DOE, everything's ready to go, you're live.
What kind of zoning do you need? I remember when we first met, like you were telling me about zoning and you're like, it's actually one of the biggest pieces of the puzzle.
Yeah. I've spent more time looking at zoning maps of cities than I ever thought I would. So it depends on every city, but one of the huge problems has been historically. So maybe we can talk a little bit about one of the things that's broken about the traditional system or the education options in general. So everyone thinks that the Department of Education is what creates all the friction for new schools launching. So they think of that as like the bureaucratic entity that creates all this, friction and red tape to keep schools out. It's actually not the case in most states. It's usually local land use and zoning. And so what happens is basically, let's take the city of Miami. It's a metro area of 7.1 million people. There are 176 buildings in the city of Miami where you can operate a school by right. That's it. And spoiler alert, they're all occupied and not available. And so if you want to operate a school in the city of Miami, you have to find other locations that are in other zoning and then go through a conditional approval process, which, as you know, requires, it's all qualitative. So it's 1,000 different, times where you can get stopped and, some person can complain or some politician gets involved because they don't want your school to open. And this is all by design. So this is all designed to make it very, very difficult to launch a new school. And so what we did in the state of Florida is we changed state law. And so we basically we drafted this legislation that allows private schools to operate by right in every church, community center, performing arts center. There's like 5 or 6 other different categories, all religious institutions, theaters in the state, and they can operate by right regardless of what local land use says. And so now there's 75,000 new locations across the state of Florida where you can operate starting July 1st. We'll be able to operate a school by right, regardless of how the zoning or the local land use authority. And so that's the kind of like structural stuff that you got to fix if you want to fix these problems, because otherwise, so like in the state of Florida, on average, the last 4 years, 35 new non-public schools have opened on average per year. So a state of 21 million people, 35 new schools.
Yep.
And it's all by design. And so that's this type of like structural reform is what you have. That's the war you got to be willing to fight if you're going to be in this space. And luckily, like most other states are much easier than Florida. Florida's actually uniquely hard from this perspective.
Wow.
But we had to go toe to toe with everybody on that battle. Like, no, that wasn't something that people were like excited about that we were trying to pass. But we got it done.
How'd you do it? And real quick, so the issue to begin with was there was a bunch of bureaucracy and legislation that said in order to operate a school, it's got to fit exactly this box.
Well, the specific issue was that the state, like most things, was ceding all control to local municipalities. And then the local municipalities, the incumbents in the education system, would ensure that there was very few places where you could start a school by right, which basically gives them either the ability to kill or make it very, very difficult to launch a school. And so for us, it was annoying, but it wasn't that big of a challenge because we're a relatively large company. We have lobbyists, we have lawyers. And so I can go, we can go fight the battles. I can meet the mayors. I can say, hey, we're trying to start a school. The mayor gets on board. They help us push it through. Like, we can get that done. But if you're a teacher that just decides that you want to start a school and you have, $10,000 saved up, you have literally no chance. And so I would talk to microschool leaders all across the state. They would apply to primary and they would say, hey, I've tried to do this like 3 times. I tried to do this 5 years ago. And I was shocked at how I worked for 3 years to try to get this live and I couldn't get it live. And so that's actually, this legislation helps primer. But what I'm more excited about is the fact that it's going to help, every small teacher that wants to launch a little community school for their neighborhood for 10 kids. Now they can go do that and they can deliver a great option. And so the structural issue was that all these local municipalities would create exclusionary zoning, which would make it impossible to launch schools. And now this is a state level preemption that comes in and says, hey, it doesn't matter if this is a church or a performing arts center or a synagogue or other religious institution or a library. Now you can launch a school by right, and you have to issue a certificate of use for that use in that building, as long as it fits these categories.
And what do all those things have in common? They're like public spaces with lots of parking that are probably in areas that are, that can handle some traffic. Like, what do all those have in common that make them all like thumbs up?
They have very similar uses in structure. So like you have a group of people that comes regularly. And in most of the cases, you have a group of kids that comes regularly to the space in the exact same room. So you already have like fire and health approval. They're already going to be up to code. There's going to be parking, traffic stuff is going to be handled. And in almost every case, the school use is actually going to be a much lower, like the peak utilization of a school in those spaces is going to be much lower than the peak utilization for the core use. And so a performing arts center, when there's an event, might have 1,000 people showing up, or a theater or library might have, 300 or 400 people showing up for various things. But for a school, it might be 30 kids, or for a microschool, it might be 60, 70 kids. And so the reason why it works is because these buildings already have the capacity and the approvals for a very similar use. And so they're able to say at the state level, hey, we feel good about these across the state, as long as they are, up to code and have the right inspections and all that.
Is it fair to say that it's like, if a micro school leader or a teacher does this and does it well, they make more money, and that's good for everybody. They get their entrepreneurial itch scratched. They get to get paid for their talents rather than just lumped in with every other teacher and paid a small salary. They're getting paid to work that 4 hours on Saturday if they have to. But
so with Primer, they make about 25% more than the district equivalent salary that they would make. And then they also get equity in Primer. So they have equity in their Microschool.
Interesting.
And then they also have additional like rev share and earnings opportunities for additional things that they might want to do, like after school or other things. So we really like treat them like entrepreneurs and say, like, hey, if you want to, if you want to do all these other things, you can make a ton of money. They get money. They get like referral bonuses for like referring students. So there's a bunch of different ways they can make money. And this comes back to if you replace all the bureaucracy and the administration with code, like you just have a great teacher running a school. So it's just a teacher and students and some real estate. And it turns out that like when you remove everything else, there's a lot more money to go around.
So it's fair to say that if they have equity in the company, they would be incentivized to bring in their great teacher friends that are also awesome to start micro schools, because it lifts all, or rising tide lifts all boats.
Exactly.
Damn.
It's the goal.
To do all this, you raised money from some of the most iconic VCs. I'm more just curious, like, what's it like to raise money from iconic VCs? How'd you pull it off? I'm reading like Sam Altman, Keith Raboy, Khosla Ventures. What's that like?
Yeah, it's I think the way to think about great investors is, or the way to think about investors in general is, you want to bring in investors who will meaningfully increase the probability of success. And so Vinod Khosla has this great saying where I think it's like 90% of investors are like negative value add. And I think that's probably true. Like there's a lot of bad investors, and there's a lot of investors that most bad investor behavior is some form of writing a check and then wanting to have extreme levels of involvement, but not having earned the right to have that level of involvement. And so thinking that the check is the ticket for, being able to micromanage or make decisions or whatever. And so I think what great investors do is they're supportive with capital, and then they know the places that they can be effective and helpful, and they are very meticulous about staying in those lanes. And the rest of the time they're supportive and empowering of you, but they will tell you very directly when they have high conviction that you're off base. And so several of our investors have told me at times like, hey, this is, I think you're overthinking this, or I think you're, I think you're thinking about this the wrong way, or I think this is a mistake, or I think you need to move faster here. But it's always been about things that they're very high conviction on. And they, either because they have operating experience building the exact same thing, or they've seen it 100 times in other portfolio companies. But for the most part, our investors are, they're all very supportive, but for the most part, they really focus on just like empowering us to be successful. And then there's a few times where they give great feedback. But I'm also the type of founder that thrives on blunt, very direct feedback. And so I try to seek that out and get as much of it as possible. But I'm sure it's different for every founder.
What will have happened for them to have seen the return they're hoping to see?
I think that Primer has a chance. Education is a $1 trillion a year market. And there historically has been, it's been very difficult for any organization to find a way to crack that in a meaningful way. So you've had like niche $50,000 a year private schools that start. You've had companies like Alt School that have tried to compete in that like very, very high end market. And then you have things like charter networks, but they're very, very difficult to scale. Starting a charter school takes probably the fastest one that's ever been launched is probably like 3 years. And usually it's like a 5 to 6 year process from hey, we want to start one, to like, hey, it's actually live from the very beginning. And so no one has really created something that is accessible, financially accessible for mass market, sort of the normal American family, and has figured out how to get the friction per net new, like marginal seat, down very, very low so it can scale quickly. And that's what we're trying to do at Primer. The whole goal is that, and the reason why I'm so obsessed with Microschools is that the OpEx and the CapEx are so much lower than traditional education. And so you have the opportunity to deliver something at a price point that's accessible to most families. And if you do it right, you can empower microschool leaders to handle most of the lifting to get the new schools off the ground so the schools can scale very, very quickly. And so if we do that, then there's going to be, everyone will be very, very happy. And there's also I think the ideological, most of our investors are very excited about the idea of an extremely rigorous, alternative to the traditional system that's available to normal families and not just families that can afford $50K a year. And so I think almost all of our investors would say they're, obviously very motivated financially about the returns. And they think it's a wonderful market and, great opportunity financially, but also that this is an existentially important problem for the United States. And like we sort of have this imperative to figure this out, whether it's Primer or something else. Someone has to crack this if we're going to solve it.
What is the cost? What should the cost be per student to go through Primer?
Our average family pays, so we allow families to use state scholarships, so they can use awesome. ESAs and vouchers and different funding that's available. And so most families end up paying a couple $100 a month so let's call it $300 a month on top of their state scholarship. And so we have a sliding scale tuition. So it depends on the campus, depends on the microschool leader, depends on a variety of factors. And so some families might pay as high as like $1,000 a month. But most families are in like the mid hundreds of dollars a month range. And then we have some families that pay much less. So we have scholarships that we give to make it accessible to even families that have very little financial resources.
What are the haters, the naysayers? What's their reason for this not happening? It sounds like,
how long do you have?
It sounds like a win-win, but what are the top reasons why people wouldn't want this to happen? And I can assume there's probably like teachers unions that think this is impeding on their stronghold on American education. Let's take that one off the table. That one seems like the obvious. Are there other reasons why people don't want to see this succeed?
Yeah, we've had more. I knew that this was going to be hard when we started it. And I knew that we were going to have aggressive opposition. And I think I thought I was being very clear-eyed about that. And I underestimated it by an order of magnitude. The level of just downright evil behavior that happens in the education industry. We've had people target our families. We've had people try to create very grave personal financial, trying to sue our microschool leaders personally, telling them they're going to bankrupt them, trying to scare them. Just really, really nasty stuff. That,
why? What are they feeling threatened by?
I think that they view us as the first. I think most of the innovation in education has happened at this upper end of the income market. And so it's been the, $30,000, $40,000, $50,000 schools. And we're the first one that has said, hey, we're actually for the normal American family. We have really high income families that come to Primer because it's an incredible education, but we're structurally built for the everyman, the normal middle class family. And I think that when people realize that there is a potential alternative to the traditional system that is gaining steam, there's a lot of things that are threatened by that. And I think that it's, you talked about the teachers unions, but there's second and third order sort of like related, it's not just the unions, it's all the other places that they have power and they've established political power. And then when you start to get traction, you become the target that needs to be shut down by any means necessary. And so that's why we've fought a lot of the fights we've fought at the state level, changing legislation. And I spend a non-trivial amount of my time has been spent over the last 2 years, basically I'll have a conversation with one of our microschool leaders or someone on our team, and I'll say Primer has your back, to the end of the earth. We will not let them, they can come do whatever they want, but we will have your back. There will not be personal repercussions for you. Because these tactics work. people are human. Like if you tell someone like, I'm going to personally bankrupt you and make sure you lose your house because of this decision you made, and you're a teacher that's made $60,000 a year your whole life, like of course you're going to be, terrified. And so, yeah, I drastically underestimated how much hate we would get as early as we got, and the sort of like viciousness of those attacks.
I'm going to start a startup that F's with the people that go after the teachers.
Great. Let's do
it. Okay. This is a story you had, but if you're successful, one of the things you're going to have to do is attract and hire talent. And you said one thing you're good at is attracting and hiring undiscovered talent. And you've been in many startups. And for those listening to this, go to the show notes. You'll see a list of his career. But what do you know about hiring talent that you've learned that maybe your common entrepreneur doesn't know?
So this is something I learned from Keith Raboy pretty early on in my career. And it's intuitive, but I think most people don't. It's intuitive at the intellectual level, but it's actually very difficult to put into practice. And so if you're starting a startup, by definition, you're resource constrained, except for the 2 years of ZERP era. And so you have to find a way to hire great people in a way that doesn't blow up all your resources. And so if you're competing for all the same engineers and designers and operations people that Facebook and Apple and Amazon and Google are competing for, definitionally you're going to have to compensate them at a competitive level. And you might find someone great that you can convince to take a bunch of equity in exchange for salary, but still you're going to need to compensate them very highly. And so a good mental model for this is that you have to figure out how to discover really great people before their greatness is legible to the outside world. And typically that means being willing to compromise on some dimension. It could be how polished they are. It could be their age. It could be what school they went to. And intentionally getting very, very good at in that dimension, filtering for people that have all the other things, but are probably overlooked for this one thing. And so I'll give you an example. Age is a perfect one. And so we've hired 2 high schoolers full-time at Primer, both of which were like phenomenal engineers. And one of which is still on the team. I think he worked part-time for us when he was 14 or 15. And then joined the team full-time, I think when he turned 16, moved to San Francisco, like got an apartment at 16. And he is one of the best engineers I've ever worked with already. And he will be, whatever phrase you want to use, top 1%, top 1%. He will be one of the greatest, technologists in the tech world of all time, I think, when it's all said and done. And he DM'd me on Twitter and just said, hey, I'm 14 years old, and I really like what you're doing at Primer. It's kind of what I would have wished I had as a kid. Can we chat? And I was like, yeah, let's chat. And I said, do you want to come to San Francisco? And he came to San Francisco and met his parents and, got to know his parents. And I've had multiple times in my career where I've talked to parents to recruit their, high school or college kid to like get them to drop out so that we can work together. And so age is a perfect example of this, but like polish, the university they went to, like all these things are other vectors that you can be willing to compromise on. But you have to find something that you can get very, very good at identifying. And then you have to be willing to take a bet on those people. And so the most fulfilling thing to me in my career has been when I take a bet on someone that I know is going to be truly great, and I put them in a position where they can go from an unknown quantity to a known quantity. And so they joined my company and no one knew who they were. They wouldn't be able to start a company on their own, or they'd have a hard time raising money or whatever. And then by the time they leave, they're, someone that can go raise a great seed round and go start a company. And so my last company, Omni, the last time I checked, of all my direct reports, 80% of those direct reports now are founders of venture-backed companies that have gone on to, raise a bunch of money and be very successful. And many of those I hired straight out of school or were college dropouts that, hadn't had any experience, and they came and worked for me. And they, worked their tail off, and they made a name for themselves, and they were able to go on and do great things. And so I regardless of what company I'm working on, regardless of all of that, there's this fundamental thing for me, which is if you can attract and hire great undiscovered people, be the place that they make a name for themselves and help them launch incredible careers, Like that is such a fulfilling motion to go through. And it's also one that pays enormous dividends because then you get to go invest in their companies, like you get to partner on things. And so there's a ton of upside to getting good at this.
I'm assuming you're a product guy. Is that fair?
Yeah.
Not an engineer.
Not an engineer, no.
Okay. So as a product guy, what do you see? Maybe let's take the example of this young kid that's 16 years old that you said might be one of the top 1%. What's he doing that you can recognize that makes him so great?
So, so I think about it for someone that's young when you're meeting them.
Yeah.
I look for a couple of things. So one is, do they have much higher clarity of thought than you would expect for someone? So this doesn't need to be age. It could be someone that has no exposure to startups, but you talk to them and you're like, wow, you actually have, from first principles, you actually have like really good instincts about how a startup would work. And you have pretty good clarity of thought. You can articulate ideas simply in a compelling way. And even if someone's never worked at a startup, you can take that and they can become extremely effective because that's foundational for a lot of roles. Another thing that I look for is just, are people willing to work extremely hard? And so I think that the whole idea that you can have this like amazing work-life balance and start a startup and be successful is totally just bonkers. And so you have to be able to be willing to work extremely hard. And so you can screen for that in the process, saying like, hey, can we meet tomorrow? And are they able to make that happen? Like, working on projects together and seeing what the turnaround time looks like. There's all these things that you can do to screen for that. And then the last thing that I look for is, do they have a track record? It's actually, for very motivated people, it's actually very easy now for them to have a track record of actually shipping and building things at a very young age.
Yeah.
And so it might be, a very simple web app or an iPhone app, or it might be a small business that they started in middle school or whatever. But have they like taken the initiative to go 0 to 1 on something? And usually, even for someone who's 16 or 17, if they're really good, they've done that multiple times. And so, funny story about this guy that we're talking about on our team. When he was like 9 or 10, he started a Discord server for a particular coding language. And it grew to be the largest Discord server in the world for this language. And Microsoft execs reached out to him and said, hey, we want to talk about like sponsoring this. Like, this is amazing. And so he downloaded a voice changer app before the Zoom call so that he could change his voice and make it sound like he was an adult because he hadn't even gone through puberty yet. And he, and then he had to basically tell them like, I don't know what's going on. My camera's broken. I'm so sorry, but there'll have to be an audio only call. And he was negotiating at like 11 years old with like Microsoft's lawyers about how they were going to partner on this server that he had built. And so that's an example of like, when you hear that story, you go, okay, this is something special. And it's not always going to be like that insane of a story for everyone, but usually there's some seeds of that kind of thing.
Okay. Education is the most interesting thing I think that you're up to, but the second most interesting thing is maybe what you're doing in San Francisco right now.
Here we go. And
I think I'm not going to say equally as important, but I think it's very, very important. And basically one of your beliefs is that situations like what's going on in San Francisco, and I don't live there, so maybe your boots on the ground, you can describe what you believe the situation to be, can actually be fixed in a world where I think we've been kind of convinced over the last few decades that like that ship sailed and this is the new world you're going to live in. So maybe let's like frame the issue as you see it today.
Yeah. So the issue, we should talk more about this sort of like paralysis that people have around problems.
Okay.
But the issue in San Francisco is you've had, I would estimate 80% of the residents of the city that have been completely unmotivated and disengaged politically, which has allowed an extremely savvy group of ideologues to capture basically every institution, from like the school board, the city college board, all the way up to the board of supervisors, which is the legislative branch of the city, for the last 20, 30 years. And they were extremely savvy at what they did. They would activate these very small groups of people. And then basically everyone just kind of like said, hey, it's not that bad. Like there's some annoying stuff that you have to deal with, but like everything else is great. All the startups are here. All the VCs are here. So we'll just like put up with that. And until like 2 years ago or 3 years ago, when we hit a tripwire, and then all of a sudden people said, hey, this is like this is whatever my mental, line in the sand was. We've crossed it. And so now I'm pissed. And now we got to go figure out how to, and either I'm going to leave, which is what a lot of people did, or now I'm like motivated to actually figure out how to solve it. And so, I think in some ways, like credit to the ideologues that figured out how to capture this, like, and I would argue like one of the most amazing cities in America for so long. But their reign is over.
What tripped the wire? Getting children involved in the mess, or was it COVID?
Yeah, I think it's I think the schools were a big thing. So like during COVID, the school board, so they closed a bunch of the schools for months and months and months. And then instead of working on how to reopen the schools, they spent all their time renaming the schools. And so they renamed, for whatever ideological reasons about this person was a racist or whatever. And there's some amazing stories about how like there was a few school board meetings where they said things that made no sense about people. Like they like looked up the wrong person. Like there would be like two people with the same name, and they looked up the wrong person that the school wasn't named after. And then they ended up figuring out that they were just on Wikipedia, like during the school board meetings, deciding which schools to rename. And they were just on the wrong Wikipedia page. And so they were reading all these things about a totally different person. So it's just like incredible incompetence. And so there's that whole renaming thing, which I think was for a lot of, particularly people that really value, communities that really value education. So people that like went to public school, first generation immigrants that view education as like the way out. That was a big thing. And then there's public safety, which is probably the biggest tripwire, where people were just sick. They're like, we shouldn't live in a city where your car gets broken into, or where you see, people using drugs on the street all the time. People's housing getting broken into is much rarer in San Francisco. It's mostly like the petty theft, like car breaking and stuff. But that whole category of things, people just eventually said, hey, enough is enough. Like, we're not dealing with this anymore.
Oh man, I got so much here. One, I would just start by saying, like, I actually love San Francisco. My buddy, I think my buddy, maybe, James Bashara?
We met a couple times, yeah.
Yeah. So anyway, he was running Tilt. I used to go visit him all the time, and I absolutely loved it. I haven't been back in a long time. So I'm glad to hear that San Francisco is doing well again. I think one of the things that shocked me from afar was when China's leader came to San Francisco, and what had been the narrative that like, yeah, it's just going to be kind of this rotting downtown forever was cleaned up.
Yeah.
And so my first question is actually, did they let everybody come back, or did it stay clean? They never really followed up with like, where are we today, a month after this arrival of.
Yeah, that was like all temporary. So there was no way to like, they just reshuffle people and, pressure wash.
Okay. So they let them all back in.
Yeah.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Interesting. Okay. Damn, I didn't think you were going to say that. So they just moved them temporarily, cleaned up everything, and then said, come on back.
I don't know if it was explicitly come on back, but it was, they created all these barricades downtown where you couldn't even, unless you lived in like a building you needed to get to, you couldn't go in these areas. So it was like not just homeless people, and, it was like everyone was kept out.
Okay. Second thing is, to set the stage, we're going to start talking about what y'all are doing about it. But what was the goal of the ideologues, or what is their ultimate ambition here? Is it the oppressed oppressor thing, and they think they're helping the oppressed, or is it deeper than that? Or like, how would you describe what they're actually after? Because they're damn passionate about it.
So one of the things I would probably pay the most money for of anything in my life would be if I could somehow get Veritaserum from Harry Potter, and I could sit down with 3 or 4 San Francisco politicians, which is the truth serum, give it to them and just ask them like a series of questions. Cause I don't know. For the life of me, I cannot figure out some of these policies. They are so, they're so disconnected from reality. The 2 best ideas that I have is one that makes more sense, and one is very sad if it's true. So the first is that San Francisco has been historically a very good launching ground for national political careers. And so there's a number of people, Dianne Feinstein, there's a long list, that started in local politics in San Francisco and then eventually went on to a national career. And so one of my theories is that there was a set of national policies that were very popular that local politicians who had national ambitions thought that they needed to lodge some win in that direction. And so they passed these local, even if they made no sense locally. So a good example is San Francisco County Jail. Decarceration was a huge thing within the Democratic Party. the average, I don't remember exactly what the numbers were, but when I looked it up when this was happening, so a bunch of San Francisco politicians made a huge push for decarceration from the San Francisco County Jail. But if you looked at the incarceration rates in San Francisco, they were like 1/6 of the national average already. And their proposal was to like empty like half the jail or something crazy. And so my best explanation is that they wanted this win to be able to, like, when they go campaign nationally, to say, oh, I was the champion of this, but it's totally devoid. Like, the optimal incarceration rate is not 0. And so if you're already at 1/6 or 1/10 or whatever of the national rate, like, you're probably fairly close to the optimal incarceration rate, but that was irrelevant to them because they just wanted to launch this win. So that's the first theory I have, which I think makes more sense. The second theory, which would be far scarier if it's true, would be that there's some sort of nefarious, some sort of willingness to sacrifice things in order to try to right the wrongs of this oppressor-oppressed dynamic or something, where it's sort of like, fine if Rome burns, if it burns for a virtuous reason or something.
Yeah.
Which that's hard. It's hard for me to believe. But several people think that's the root of it, but I really don't know.
I fall more in that camp as a witness to it all, but that really doesn't matter. Okay. So wire gets tripped 2 or 3 years ago.
Yeah.
And San Francisco is filled with some brilliant minds. And well, actually, one step back, paralysis that people have around problems. What is the paralysis that people have around problems?
I think people don't realize that you can just do things. Like, I talked to so many people when we went to change the state law in Florida for primer. I probably heard from 50 different people that were like, man, this has been a problem for us for 10 years, or I've been struggling with this for 12 years. And like, it wasn't easy to get this passed, but like, it wasn't that hard. It wasn't the hardest thing I've ever done. Like, it took, 12 months, took a bunch of meetings, a bunch of convincing, taking some body blows, spending a little bit of money, but like, eventually you got it done. And I mean, any of those people could have gone and done it if they had just decided, hey, like, we're just going to go change state law and then make all these problems go away. And I think in San Francisco, to move to the tripwire point, I think that what people want is you underestimate how much potential energy exists about a problem that isn't converted into kinetic energy, because there's no viable place for that energy to go. And so people don't actually convert their desire for change or for fixing something into action because they feel like there's no viable path to actually go invest that. And so San Francisco is a perfect example where you had a growing number of people for the last decade who thought San Francisco was off track, but there was no place to convert that feeling of, hey, I wish I could do something to fix this, to actually impacting change. There were these little orgs that popped up that were basically like country clubs for moderates, where they did absolutely nothing, but they all just hung out all the time and they never won a single election. And so people just got jaded and they said, okay, well, I'm not going to give money to these organizations. I'm not going to volunteer these organizations because they're not serious people that are going to deliver change. And then once you create the credible effort, that people realize, oh, actually, I can convert this potential energy into kinetic energy and actually go change these problems through money or time. All of a sudden, the tsunami of people that are all feeling this silently all get involved. And that's where everything starts changing. And I think this is probably happening in a lot of cities. And if someone would just start the movement, like, you would actually see a ton of these people all of a sudden coalesce and say, hey, I'm willing to donate my time or money or energy or whatever. But no one's like taking the plunge to actually start it.
Okay, well, let's spend some time giving that person maybe listening the confidence to be that person in their city. What's the playbook to making this happen?
So yeah, I would preface by saying I'm just a humble catalyzer, supporter, et cetera. There's people that are working on this full time in San Francisco.
Gary Tan for mayor.
Yes. So I think that the thing that we learned in San Francisco was that there, you think that these entrenched political organizations that are very good at winning elections, you think of it almost like dark arts from the outside. It's almost like, oh, I wonder how they do that. But if you just think of it like anything else, which is, hey, we have, a group of voters that we need to educate and convince to vote in a certain way. It actually turns out that it's like actually relatively straightforward. And if you have people that are really good at marketing and, Facebook ads and targeting and data models and all those things, it's actually not that hard to assemble a team that can get it done. And so now the moderate groups in San Francisco are actually way more competent than the far left progressive groups. And they've only been around for like 3 years. And these people have been doing this for, 20 years. There's a hilarious thing where there's a far left voter guide in San Francisco, and there's the moderate voter guide, and we got the moderate voter guide to rank above the far left voter guide. And they were like, they like didn't understand how that was possible, because they thought SEO was just based on how long your site has been around. And so they went on this huge conspiratorial rant about how we like convinced the Google executives to like, because they don't understand SEO. And so there's these basic things that if you just execute well, you can do. And so the hardest thing, so I'll zoom out. So what we did is basically we created a viable organization called GrowSF that people could donate money to, and time and energy, and know that that money was going to be well spent very, very efficiently. So it's a classic startup. So like very lean staff, very low OpEx, maximum dollars going to actually solving the problem. And that if you donate to that, you were going to see returns. And then once we had that going, then it was all about, okay, how do you make these dollars as effective as possible? And so that's where data science and marketing, all these things come in. And so a good example is like, GrowSF doesn't use any consultants for anything, for ad spend or anything. And so like if you typically a political consultant will mark up all the dollars that you spend on advertising and mailers by like 2 to 5x. And so GrowSF doesn't do any of that. They do it all in-house, and then all their dollars go farther than their competitors because there's no consultants. And so that's the sort of like organization side. The hardest part is getting candidates that are going to run, because no one wants to run for these things. Like all the good people are like, why would I ever go spend 4 years on the San Francisco Board of Supervisors? That sounds terrible. And even worse is like school board and all these really junior roles. And so the hardest part is that you really need a bench. And so what the progressives in San Francisco were very, very good at is they had this amazing bench system where they would basically take over the city college board and the school board and all these more junior positions. And then those people would rise in prominence, and then they would be ready to backfill any positions on the Board of Supervisors when those people went and ran for state office or termed out or whatever. And so you had this dynamic where like, they had, multiple waves of people like ready to go. And the common sense groups like had very few people. And so that was honestly, I think the hardest part for GrowSF was convincing really good people to run. And so for the first couple of years, it was like, okay, we have like one candidate in this election we can support, but like everyone else kind of like sucks. And now for the first time, like this election coming up in November, there's almost for every single seat, there's going to be like a GrowSF endorsed candidate for those seats. And I think most of them will win. And so that's the hardest challenge, is getting highly qualified people that are former startup founders, people that have run businesses, former investors, whatever, to actually convince them to actually go run.
How'd you convince them?
I wasn't very involved in it, but I think once they saw that there was an organization behind them that could help them win, that's when people say, okay, well, maybe this is worth doing, and there's a coalition behind it. The other thing that GrowSF did that was extremely smart is they built this data model that allowed them to get really smart about which elections were most vulnerable. And so you can look at all these, how do people vote on this ballot prop? How do people vote for this election? And you can start to understand the dynamics of districts. And then you can figure out where, let's in San Francisco's case, the Board of Supervisors that's representing a district, which is the legislative branch of the government, that you can find that district is really misaligned with that supervisor, which gives you some indication of, so you could do that for every district and then figure out which supervisors are most misaligned with their district, which correlates to how vulnerable they are. And so once you know that, you can then prioritize which districts. And so none of this is rocket science, but I think that you could run a very similar playbook. And I think in GrowSF, was founded 3 years ago or 4 years ago. And in 2 years in, they flipped they beat an incumbent Board of Supervisors member for the first time in San Francisco history, never been done before. And they defeated an incumbent with one of their candidates. And then this past election in March, they won 21 of 24 seats available on the Democratic Party Central Committee. And then in November, I think it'll be another similar result. And they're going to be 5 years in, and they're going to basically have flipped almost the entirety of San Francisco's government towards common sense, people.
Is a Board of Supervisors something that's unique to San Francisco, or does every city have Board of Supervisors? I've never actually heard that terminology.
It's called a bunch of different things, but typically there's it's like the executive branch and the legislative branch.
Okay.
Yeah.
The legislative branch of SF Gov is made up of 11 members of the Board of Supervisors. A very expensive supervisor race might raise $500,000. So for $500,000, you could fully fund an election to control 9% of city government in one of the most influential cities in the world.
That's the pitch.
So imagine what you could do with like $1 million.
Exactly.
and $1 million investment that's successful could unlock billions of dollars of value.
Yeah. And I mean, it's not as simple. So there's tons of candidates that have like raised a bunch of money and then totally failed. So you can't just win elections on money, but it is a huge piece of it because it's what funds the ad buys and everything. And so the point is that, you know, we spend all this time on there's all this energy that goes towards the federal elections and we get so up in arms about that. But the reality is like everyone who's listening to this, like their local government impacts their quality of life and their day to day like 100x more than whatever's going to happen in November at the federal level. But we spend all of our energy on that when in reality, like all of your time and energy would actually have a way higher ROI on local stuff. But most people don't even know who their mayor or a city council member is.
Has anybody in San Francisco, could this be like a nonprofit startup where different cities could basically hire this talent out of San Francisco to come help them save their city? Because it also seems to me like there's a lot of like tech strategy built into this that might not, like if I was to do Grow Fort Worth, which I don't think I would need to do. We're not.
You got it pretty good here.
We're good right now.
Yeah.
Thank God. But if I did, I'd be like, well, there's not a lot of folks in town that are as tech focused. Have you all thought about using this playbook for other cities to adopt, or is that not really a thought right now?
I don't know. I know that people have approached the GrowSF team about other cities for sure. I definitely think there's a way to like open source the playbook. And I mean, some of it is talent, but it's also just some of this stuff is like, you got to learn trial and error. And then once you figure it out, you figure it out. And so if, I would love to see the founders like open source it and then other cities could jump on. And I think there's probably talented, actually, there are probably talented people in every city that could take the torch and run with it. It just takes them, you know, knowing what it is.
Well, you talked about this. We talked about this, the vibe shift, a return to religion, getting married, having kids, working on real problems. And we can talk about all those, but the real problems thing, like even if you look at the October 7th issue and we go back to what's happening at the private universities up in the Northeast, what Elon's done with Twitter, GrowSF is going after the local council. Elon's going after like the head of every major global institution and country. Then you have folks like Bill Ackman that was talking about like I think he called it a think and do tank. So we're not just going to do a think tank, a think and do, where he's basically like, if you're a cheater, a liar, or whatever, we're going to cancel the cancelers.
Yep.
Then you just like, you can go down the list. You see Rogan and Tucker Carlson, and I even throw now Dana White from UFC in there. But you are seeing this generation. I think the wire tripped for not just San Francisco. I think it's tripped across the country.
Yeah.
And I'm certainly feeling it, and I support it to the extent that we just get back to common sense. That's all I think anybody really wants. And so I'm excited what y'all are doing in San Francisco, but I think it's a major shift.
Yeah, I think you're right. And the cool thing that's happening in San Francisco is like it's bipartisan. It's not like there's people on all sides of the aisle from all, you know, demographics and voting history and political history that are like, hey, we're done with this crap. Like, we're done with the ideological stuff. We're like, we need a functioning city that works. And there's a bunch of, you know, you could use the example of like, you know, now it's like in vogue to have kids, or more in vogue to have kids and get married and join a church and all these things. And these things they're political to some extent, but they're apolitical in a lot of ways too. And I think it's a real vibe shift. And I think it happened, maybe 2 years ago is when I started noticing it. But I think it's actually accelerating. Like, I don't think it's peaked. I think it's still accelerating.
Oh, I think it's in the early innings.
Yeah.
People are starting to build confidence. I mean, I was in that camp for a little bit of like, man, this ship has sailed, like, poor us. The other part is you go to other areas of the world, call it outside of the West, and we just look like buffoons to a lot of the world. Especially those in like third world countries that are like, man, the things that we wish we had those problems to argue about.
Sure. Yeah. Luxury beliefs.
Luxury beliefs to a core. You said, I thought this was awesome. You said it's possible to have kids young, be a great dad, a husband, still work your face off. But another thing you meant by that is we need more people doing those things in positions of leadership. And you went on the record, at least to me, and you said, if we had 100 times these people, we could solve some of humanity's greatest problems. what do people that have that those things going on in their life, what are they able to offer the world? Why do you think they would solve humanity's greatest challenges?
I think, yes, I think what's interesting to me, the shift that I've noticed is, we had our first, my son was born 6 years ago, and the tone when we started having kids, I had so many questions 6 years ago, like, oh, how are you going to like run a startup and, have a kid, or how are you going to, do all these things you're doing and have a kid? And it was like almost always like skepticism and sort of like light shade, sort of like, maybe you're not going to be as committed to your startup because of this or whatever. Now, it's almost always like talked about in the positive, like, oh, I think it's so amazing that you have, soon 3 kids and you're, running a company and working on these other things. And so my view is that once you're married and have kids, I think it fundamentally, I mean, everyone agrees like this, I don't think it's contrarian, that it fundamentally shifts the way you think about the world, the way you think about your life, legacy, all these things. And so you approach problems in a different way. And there's practical ways that shows up. The thing I think that's most incredible about having kids is that it creates a very high opportunity cost to every minute of your life. And so if you're at the office, when I'm at the office, I'm for the most part in the zone for the entire time that I'm there. Like, I'm not just, doinking around, like doing stuff that I might've done before I had kids, because if I'm, at the office, it means I'm not with my kids, and I would love to be with my kids. And so I'm going to make sure that every single second is as productive as possible. And I think that's a wonderful feature of having kids. There's practical things like that, but then there's also this bigger picture thing where I think it makes you think about the world in a different, on a different time scale and in a different way, because you have these kids that are 20, 30 years younger than you that are going to inherit, the world that you leave them. And I think if we made it more, permissible, and made it feel more possible to work on very, very hard problems, work extremely hard, work long hours, and have kids, and have a family. One, I think it's amazing for the kids to be able to see their, mother or father working extremely hard. But then 2, I think that those people as role models, then it doesn't feel, for the next generation, it doesn't feel impossible to start a family and also go work on these world changing problems. And so, I hope that that I can, and lots of other people can, inspire people to not think that these things are mutually exclusive. And I think that's part of the vibe shift that's happening.
I'm curious, maybe everybody that starts a startup thinks they're conquering some extremely hard problem. Although you look at some of the startups and they're selling like digital cats or something like that, which I don't look at as solving a huge need. But one thing you said earlier on, you said people can do stuff. So I'm going to break this into like 3 parts. People can do stuff.
Yep.
You decided, I'm going to go tackle a problem that's extremely hard, but I'm also going to get the most out of each day. So if somebody's listening to this going, man, I really want to go after that huge problem, but I have kids, everything you just said, what does a day look like for you, or maybe a week? Like, how do you get the most out of your day to inspire other people that like it can be done?
Yeah. So the first thing I want to say is I think that people often shy away from these big problems because they correctly understand that the probability of failure is much higher. And so the probability of us succeeding at Primer is much lower than if I would have started a, small business accounting firm or something, something with a higher probability of success. But I think it's important for people to know that me and many other people like me will respect you way more for trying something extremely hard, trying to solve a very hard problem and failing, than succeeding at a much easier, less important problem. And I think that's something that people will misunderstand. They think that, it would be better to succeed at some tiny little easy thing. And it's actually, there's a lot of people that will respect you way more if you take the big swing, even if you fail. As far as, I think the biggest thing practically is just you have to be extremely disciplined with your time. So, never talked about this publicly before, but you asked. So, I make breakfast for my kids every single morning. So, wake up, every morning that I'm home for the past 6 years, I've made breakfast for my kids, hot breakfast, eggs, bacon, the whole thing. And, I wake up around 5:30, work for a little bit, start breakfast. And then by the time they're up at 7, breakfast is ready. My wife and kids come down, we eat breakfast together, and then I'm, off to work. And I, work a full day, typically work more at night. I try to be home for dinner when I can, and then work more after dinner. And so there's sacrifices that I make. I have no hobbies. I don't play video games. Never. I don't think I've ever played in a video game as an adult. I don't do anything like that. I basically spend all my time building Primer, working on very, very important things like fixing San Francisco, investing in companies, things like that. And with my family, that's it. And so, there's definitely trade-offs, but if you're extremely disciplined with your time, like my kids, I think I have a wonderful relationship with my kids. I do spend a decent amount of time with them. I make sure that there's blocks on the weekends where I work a lot on the weekends, but I make sure there's blocks that I'm completely locked in the zone with them. But the most important thing is like, you can't delude yourself. Like time is zero sum. And so every minute that I'm spending building Primer is time I'm not spending with my kids. And the bar for me on the things that I work on is if my kids came to me when they're 18 and they said, Dad, I've been thinking about, my childhood and I love you. I, feel connected with you, but like, I wish you would have spent more time with us doing this. Or I wish that, you would have, I remember you missed this thing or whatever. I want to be able to tell them what I was working on, and I want them to feel like that was a worthy sacrifice. I want them to be proud of how I was spending my time, and I want them to feel partnership in that sacrifice. And so this is by no means a cop out for being an absentee father, and that's not what I'm advocating for. But one of the beautiful things about working on hard problems is I am 100% convinced, like my kids are obsessed with Primer. They love Primer. They look at videos of Primer kids. My son is 6. He asked me, how many new schools are we launching this year? He feels like some real partnership with me in this. And so when I'm here traveling this week, and he knows that I'm working on, growing Primer and launching new schools and meeting families. And so if you're working on these hard problems, the nice thing is that when you do encounter the opportunity cost, whether that's with friends or family or elsewhere, hopefully, it becomes something that you can be proud of what those trade-offs are. And then in the case of your kids, when they're older, hopefully they'll understand and they'll feel some partnership in that. And it hopefully will inspire them to go do the same thing when they're older and realize that there are trade-offs, but those trade-offs are worth it.
How do you include your kids in your work at that age? Is it just like being around, like if you're just in the vortex, you can feel it, or are you intentional about telling them what's going on and stuff?
Very intentional. Yeah. So I tell them about, my son is 6 and my daughter's 3. So my daughter understands a lot less about it, but my son is very in tune with, like, he understands basically exactly what we do, what the, model is. He understands the problems that are hard. He understands like the types of things I'm working on, obviously not in like, extensive detail. He gets excited when there's wins. If we, open a new school or, something fun happens, like he understands that. I think that, this is like the taking kids seriously thing from Primer, but with my kids, like I bring them in a lot on business stuff. And I think they're actually like way more capable than most people realize. I think my son within a year or two, like we'll probably start a little business together and work on something. Like he's totally capable of starting to think through things and work on different ideas. So yeah, I totally think kids, bringing kids into it is a wonderful thing, even at a very young age.
That's awesome. All right, we're going to finish on a story that you've never said publicly.
Okay.
You said, I realized it's all fake.
Mm.
So you worked at Gumroad, I think in 2015.
Yeah.
You don't have to say names, but you had this realization that it's all fake. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, it's funny. We were talking about this podcast and you're asking me interesting stories. And I saw Balaji, who is a friend and prime investor. He was talking about, I think there was some book that came out, Jonathan Haidt's new book or something that was like a bestseller on Amazon, but didn't make the New York Times list. And so he was talking about, he was sort of like talking about how the New York Times list is fake or it's editorial and not actually just data backed. And it made me think about this. So, and there's enough distance where I think I can tell these stories now. So yeah, I was, dropped out of college, worked at Square, and then joined Gumroad. And Gumroad is a e-commerce platform for selling, like artists to sell things like music, films, books, apps, anything. And we worked with, a lot of the biggest names in music, particularly, but also in publishing and films too. And so my job was basically to go close these deals. And so we got, Eminem and Coldplay and, all the big artists, to use Gumroad. And so I was running around, meeting all the managers, and I was 20 years old. I didn't really know what I was doing, but I was just running around, trying to close these deals. And, one of the largest artists in the world, which is not one of the artists that I named, used Gumroad for their album release to launch an album. And, I got a text from their manager, and he said, "Hey, can we jump on a call?" And I was maybe like a year into Gumroad at this point. And I'm like, "Yeah, sure, whatever." So we jumped on a call, and he said, "Hey, I need you to add a 0 to all the sales that you report this week, to the different agencies." And I couldn't process what I was here. I was like, "What? Like, this is an automated thing? Like, how, what do you mean?" Like, "Well, the sales were like a little light from what we expected. And it's really important that the album is number 1 this week because this is really, one of the largest artists in the world. Like, we can't not be number 1 on release week. And so we need you to add a 0. And I said no. And he went on to explain, like, basically like that this is like normal. Like, he basically he made it sound like I was like insane for thinking this was weird. And that this was just like a totally normal thing. And this went on to happen with books, music, where we get these requests. And it was like this moment for me where I realized I'd spent my whole life, like you hear like, oh, the new number 1 album, the new number 1 New York Times bestseller, all these things. And I had been I had created a deeply ingrained psychological model for what those phrases meant. If I heard the phrase number 1 album, number 1, there was all these things that I believed to be true about that statement. And in like a single 7-minute phone call, it all just crumbled. And I was, 20 years old. I was like, and I remember like, I literally remember where I was sitting, like when this phone call happened, and I didn't know how to process what I was hearing. And then it happened over and over and over again over the course of the next 2 or 3 years. And it was the first time where I think I realized like there's all these constructs in life that you've been socially conditioned to either believe are true or accurate or whatever framework we want to use, that are really just constructs. They're not actually what you believe. The thing that's backing them is not the thing that's actually backing them. And there's a lot of other examples like this. And this ties into the, like, you can just do thing as well. Like you have a similar construct about things that are hard or impossible or can't be done. But it turns out like the reason why they're the way they are is someone just like you decided to do them and set that law or do that thing. And you're just as capable as them to go and do it. And so it was a very like formative moment for me, that changed my perception on a lot of things, mostly in a negative way, but in some ways a positive way.
All right, Ryan, thanks for joining me today.
Thanks for having me.
It was awesome.